We read in the book of Exodus that Moses was born at a time when the male children of the Hebrews were being put to death. His mother placed him in a basket and floated him on the Nile. This was not an act of desperation, but it was entrusting him to the providence of God. He was rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh, and he grew up in the palace. But he identified himself with his own people when he learned that he was Hebrew, and this led to his expulsion and flight into the wilderness. He lived in the desert for 40 years. He met Jethro, the priest, married his daughter Zipporah. I live at Sinai, and I know that in the winter there are harsh winds blowing through these barren granite mountains. And I've often thought, did Moses think that having been expelled, he was no longer in a position to help his people? But all of this was in the providence of God. For when he had lived in the desert for 40 years, he saw a bush that was burning without being consumed, and he drew near to see what this strange sight was. He heard the voice of God speaking with him and commanding him to go back to Pharaoh and deliver the children of Israel from bondage. We all know the story of how he did so, how he led his people through the Red Sea and came to the mountain where God had first appeared to him. And there he received the 10 Commandments and beheld the tabernacle and was commanded to construct the model of the tabernacle here below, so that the worship that was offered to God here below would be in parallel with the worship that is given by the angels in the heavens. We also know that 600 years later, the prophet Elijah was fleeing from Jezebel, and an angel said, "Eat and drink, for the journey before you is long." And he traveled 40 days and 40 nights, and he came to Sinai, the mountain of God. And there he beheld an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And he beheld a strong wind, but God is not in the wind. And then God spoke to him in a still, small voice, or as it says in the Greek, the voice of a gentle breeze. So it was at Sinai that God had revealed himself to these 2 prophets in such an extraordinary way. At the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 4th century, when men went out into the desert to devote their lives to prayer and fasting, they also wanted to identify this place where God himself had said, "The ground whereon you stand is holy ground." We can trace an uninterrupted history then from the end of the 3rd, the beginning of the 4th century. It was not only a site for monastics, but it became a site for pilgrims. The earliest surviving Christian pilgrim account was written by a nun named Egeria, who came from Spain. She wrote in medieval Latin, and although her remarks are informal remarks to share with other people, everything that she said is so important because it shows the state of the churches and the shrines in the end of the 4th century. She went to Jerusalem and made her way across the top of the Sinai Peninsula and then down the west coast, and from there they came to visit Sinai. So they ascended to the peak, first of all, and she mentioned the recently constructed chapel at the top. Below the peak was the cave where God had appeared to the prophet Elijah, and there also they had a church in the 4th century. And it was only after having seen and worshipped these 2 churches that she came into the valley below. And she writes, "In the valley there is a garden, and in the garden there's a church next to the bush." So we know from that there was a well-established monastic presence in the latter half of the 4th century. There were churches where there are churches even today, and the monks came and brought fruits and vegetables from their gardens for the sustenance of the pilgrims who had come. They read to them the passages of the scripture concerning all the events that had taken place, and then they celebrated the Eucharist for the pilgrims. And it's astonishing to think that all of these things are in place even today. We have monks living in the desert, but we also have pilgrims that come from around the world. So this sense of continuity is one of the strongest feelings for pilgrims that come to the monastery even today. It was in the 6th century that the Emperor Justinian built the fortress and the great basilica at the place of the burning bush. We have daily services in a church that dates from 550. And when we have the bishop celebrating the liturgy, he holds the chalice and he says, "Remember, O Lord, the founders of the sacred monastery, the sovereigns Justinian and Theodora." And someone has commented, in Sinai, it's as if the 6th century never really ended. The monastery can trace an uninterrupted history. Very little is known about the monastery before the 11th and 12th century with the establishment of the Latin kingdom in Jerusalem. And then we know the long and complex history of the area. It was in the 7th century that it came under Arab rule, but from that time until today, it has been a tiny, respected, very, very remote monastery. All of that changed in the 1960s and 1970s with the construction of roads to the area, and then pilgrims who came to Jerusalem were encouraged to include Sinai on their itinerary. The monastery today can have over 1,000 people every day, whereas 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we might have had 20 people in 1 year. So it has changed a lot, and yet it is still the same monastery that has existed there from the 4th century. We try to maintain this careful balance that has been the motif of the monastery for all of its history. The present archbishop came in 1961. He became the archbishop in 1973. He knew the monastery when it was still seldom visited and not very well known, so it is under his time that the monastery has become such a goal for pilgrims and visitors throughout the area. And he has been able to keep this careful balance between having the tranquility and the peace that we need to survive as a monastic community, and yet being the goal of many, many pilgrims and visitors and scholars. He has said that perhaps it is in the providence of God that no monastery is as remote as it once was, because today people are looking for spiritual solace and spiritual consolation, and we have an obligation, having inherited this great spiritual tradition, to share it with the world, and that is our effort through sharing the resources that we have there at the monastery, and also visiting and making presentations about the monastery. The monastery library has been well known for centuries, and it contains some of the most important copies of the scriptures. Scholars have come from the 19th century when travel became easier in the Middle East, and from that time until today, scholars have seen the importance of the library for the history of the scriptures, for the understanding of the history of the liturgy, and it is essential for study of many, many different fields. But it is remote, and even if a scholar can come to Sinai, he often cannot stay there for very long. In 1950, the Library of Congress photographed some of the more important manuscripts for microfilm. But people have shown me some of these microfilms, and especially the small writing of the text is very often illegible. And so the Archbishop started a few years ago a program to photograph the manuscripts with high-resolution digital cameras. And that was my job when I first went to the monastery in 1996. In this way, we're able to share the many manuscripts that we have. And we are photographing them with natural light. We're also using multispectral imaging to recover what are known as palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been overwritten, where the manuscript has two levels of writing. Many times you can read the earlier text in the margins of the manuscript, but it is very, very difficult to read anymore. But through digital photography, we can photograph these manuscripts with different wavelengths of light, and then they can be processed, and many times these faint images underneath the existing text become clear. This has also expanded our knowledge of the history of the monastery and been a great gain to scholars working in these fields. It was only in the 1950s that books were published about the Sinai icons, and these inspired Kurt Weitzman to go there. He was a professor of art history at Princeton University, and it was his work that really revealed to the world the very, very special collection of icons that we have at Sinai. The most famous is an icon of Christ, and when it was first published, it still had overpainting, and the two Greek scholars who studied it said, perhaps 13th century, but with archaic features. It was later cleaned, and when Weitzman saw it, he was stunned. He said, this has to be from the 6th century. And he was able to substantiate that by making comparisons to known depictions from Constantinople, and every scholar has accepted that dating since that time. But we also know that in the 7th and 8th centuries, there was what is known as iconoclasm, when the painting of icons was forbidden. This had no effect at Sinai because Sinai was outside of the Byzantine Empire at the time, and so we can trace the continuous history of iconography all through the centuries of iconoclasm. There was a flourishing of iconography at Sinai in the 12th century, and there are many icons in what is known as Crusader icons, because they are icons that have Latin features or Latin inscriptions. These are just now being studied. Were they painted for Latin patrons? Were they painted in Cyprus, which was under Latin rule, or in Jerusalem during the time of the Latin kingdom? Not much is known about them, and they are still being studied, but they are a very, very important class of icons. So we have icons all the way to the present time. Kurt Weitzman photographed these, and his negatives could only be studied by people doing doctorates under his direction. He was very, very protective of them. When he passed away, they remained in the archives of Princeton University, and they have recently scanned them because they are fragile negatives, and they were worried about shifts in color over time. This coming April, they're going to have a conference devoted to the Sinai icons, when they hope to make these accessible at low resolution so that people can study in detail icons that have not been accessible to scholars before. And we hope to be able to photograph the icons of Sinai in even higher resolution and with better facilities than were available to Kurt Weitzman when he came there in the 1950s and 1960s. So the manuscripts and the icons are becoming more accessible. People have said, this means that you don't have to travel to Sinai. But I think in reality, it encourages people to go even more so because they want to see the originals. But in the midst of preserving so many things, the architecture, the icons, the manuscripts, the most important obligation of the community is to keep the spiritual heritage alive. A community can become like a museum where the monks maintain the facilities, but they lose contact with the spiritual heritage. And one scholar came and he said, anybody can read books, we want to see the living tradition. And it was a reminder to us that having inherited such a remarkable spiritual heritage, it is our obligation to maintain that. And I think that this is being acknowledged increasingly in the fields of art history, liturgical studies, biblical studies. We have to understand where these manuscripts came from. We have to see the icons in the manuscripts not just as works of scholarship and works of art, but we have to understand the context in which they were created. The manuscripts were created for worship, for study, to sustain the spiritual life, to guide the spiritual life. The icons were created as works of devotion. So we look at the context and we understand and study the context in which they were created, and this also becomes an essential element of the study. In the past, art museums presented art from many different peoples, many different epochs, and it was felt that art was a universal language where we can look at objects as objects and compare the one to the other. But I think that there is a very healthy appreciation, increasingly, for the context in which works of art were created, and this has become an essential dimension for the study of the manuscripts and of the works of art. Sinai has many different messages for today, and the Archbishop has said that one of the messages it has is as a place of peace and coexistence. I mentioned that Sinai came under Arab rule in the 7th century. The Bedouin who live in the area trace their descent to the soldiers who first built the monastery in the 6th century. And I've told them almost no one knows where his ancestors were in the 6th century, but you do. So it is exceptional that they have such a heritage. And one of the Bedouin who knows English very well spoke to me and he said, our bond with the monastery is genetic because it has been in place for so many centuries. The Bedouin became Muslims with the coming of Islam at the end of the 7th century. So from that time you have had the monks living in community surrounded by the Bedouin. The monks are Christians, they are celibate, they speak Greek, their whole culture is Greek and Christian. The Arabs speak Arabic, they have families, they are Muslims, their whole culture is Arabic and Muslim. So in the areas of culture, of faith, of language, all the things that make for conflict, we differ. And yet at the same time, throughout the whole history of the monastery, we trace an amazing collaboration where the monks support the monastery and the monastery helps and supports the Bedouin. And that continues to the present day. When you read about the news in the Middle East and all the conflicts, it seems hopeless. But then when you see Sinai and the collaboration and the respect that we have, you have fervent Christians, you have fervent Muslims who have managed to live in peace and mutual respect, and it becomes a model and an emblem of hope in a very troubled part of the world. So these are some of the themes that any visitors to Sinai must reflect on, and a brief introduction to the heritage of Sinai and to its significance today. We are eager to share the message that Sinai has for the world, and we welcome anyone who wants to visit the area. It is still remote, difficult to reach, but not seldom visited as it was before. The spiritual goals of the community are still in place, and they revolve around the schedule of services. It says in the Psalms, 7 times a day have I prayed unto thee. And the liturgical cycle is 7 services throughout the course of the day. We begin at 4 o'clock in the morning with the service of nocturnes, which goes into the service of matins, and then every day we have the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. These are very long services, but we say them briskly. And I think this is also a tradition of Sinai. An Anglican bishop named Pocock visited Sinai in 1740, and he said, they do not abbreviate the services, but they shorten them by saying them quite rapidly. So we can say the services, we begin at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then on the weekday we are finished by about 7:30, and by 8:30 or perhaps a little later on Sundays. A few times in the year we have vigils, which begin at 9 o'clock in the evening. We have the celebration of Vespers until about midnight, and then we go into the celebration of Matins, and then the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, and sometimes these services end at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So this is the special time for services held in the tranquility of the night. But on an average day, we have nocturnes, matins, and the liturgy beginning at 4 o'clock in the morning. At noon, we have the reading of the 3rd hour and the 6th hour, and then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we have the reading of the 9th hour, the celebration of Vespers, and we conclude with the service of Small Compline, which is the 7 services in the day. Because the Divine Liturgy is not counted as in liturgical time. so it is not included among the 7 services. It is a very beautiful thing to have the services in a church that has been used for worship since the middle of the 6th century. But we still have the same order of services in the same language. And when we see a lectionary from the library dating from the 10th century, it's astonishing to think that we could take that and use that in the services, and no one would realize that we're using a 10th century manuscript, because the readings and the language have all remained the same from that time to our own day. The time in common prayer must be balanced with time in individual prayer. And in individual reading, we prepare ourselves for the time together in common prayer. The hymns are like the distillation of the Orthodox theology, and they are so profound that it is impossible to absorb every aspect of every hymn. So they tend to present themselves to us at a more rapid pace than we could absorb. But it is by preparing ourselves through readings and through reflections before the services that the services become more meaningful. And then each year, with each celebration, we are exposed to an aspect of the service that we had not considered before. The first name of the monastery was the Monastery of the Virgin Mary, and it is referred to as such in Procopius' history, who wrote a work called The History, commissioned by the Emperor Justinian to talk about all of the constructions that he had commissioned. It is thought that the Annunciation is then the earliest feast of Sinai, because the revelation to Moses at the burning bush was seen as a prefiguration of the Incarnation and of the Virgin Mary. And there are icons of the Virgin Mary superimposed on the burning bush, and she is known as Our Lady of the Burning Bush. The first hymn in the service of the Annunciation mentions the burning bush and this parallel. But we know that the prophets Moses and Elijah appeared speaking with Christ at the Transfiguration. And when they built the great basilica, the focal point of the whole basilica is the mosaic of the Transfiguration. At the very top left, you see Moses taking off his sandal at the burning bush. At the very top right, you see Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. And he is also standing in a cleft of the rock, because he asked to behold God. And God said, I will hide you in a cleft of the rock, and my glory shall pass by. But in the apse below, you have the Transfiguration. Christ is radiant with glory. His garments have become white like unto the snow. To either side are the prophets Moses and Elijah speaking with him, and below are the apostles Peter, James, and John, who ascended Mount Tabor and beheld the Transfiguration. The original church was quite austere. The walls were plain granite. So from the first time a person entered the church, his gaze would have been directed to the mosaic of the Transfiguration. This became dark through the centuries, through many centuries of the use of candles and incense. When they built the present iconostasion, the templon at the front of the church, they built it almost all the way to the ceiling, because the mosaic was hardly visible at that time. Even photographs taken in the 1950s show it almost black, and you can barely make out some of the figures. It was when Kurt Weizmann came there that they cleaned the mosaic, and then it was again bright and shining. And he photographed it, and it is a spectacular photography. But if you look at it up close, it wasn't really cleaned. He was afraid of using solvents, and so he scraped the mosaic pieces with dental tools to remove the film on the pieces of glass without introducing solvents into the plaster that holds everything. When we were preparing for an exhibit of icons at the Getty in 2006, they came and they said, how long has it been since you've looked at the mosaic? And we said, well, not since Kurt Weizmann was here in the 1960s. And they said, it's time to look at it again. So they invited one of the most respected conservators of mosaics to come. They put up scaffolding, and when you tap on a mosaic, you can tell whether it is firmly attached to the wall or whether pockets have developed behind the mosaic. And when he saw the mosaic, he was stunned that it was in such beautiful preservation. But then when he climbed up and began tapping on it, he said, it's a miracle it's still here, because some of it, especially at the icon of Christ, the focal point of the entire mosaic, had separated from the wall and was just being held in place by lateral pressure. So they gave us an estimate that it will cost $500,000 to attach this to the wall, to clean it, and to conserve it. The Archbishop was asking, who can give us this funding? The Getty had promised half of it if we could find someone else for the other half. And it was soon after that the Emir of Qatar visited. He was very impressed by the monastery. He had a banker in Geneva who was Greek, and he asked him, do you know about St. Catherine's Monastery? And he said, yes, it's a fine, noble institution. If you want to support them, you would do well to do so. So he sent us word through his ambassador to Egypt. He would fund the conservation of the mosaic on the condition that he is the sole funder. So he gave us a check for the entire amount, and it is another example of the harmony that exists between the monastery and the surrounding world of Islam. The mosaic has just been cleaned, but until now it has been covered up with paper. We hope at the latter part of December to remove the paper, to make the final examination, and to have the approval of the authorities and of the conservators who have been working with us, so that we can begin dismantling the scaffolding that has been in place for the past 5 years. And then this coming Easter, this coming Pascha, we will have the first glimpse of the restored and cleaned mosaic. Since they had scaffolding in place that allowed them access, they used chemicals to clean the mosaic, because then they could put up blotting paper with water to draw the chemicals out of the plaster. They used traditional plaster, but they tinted it so that a later conservator could see what was original and what had been added later. And the great dilemma that they faced was these small areas throughout the mosaic where tesserae had fallen out through the centuries. In the past, it had been filled with plaster and painted so that you did not notice these lacunae. But when the mosaic was cleaned, the paint came off and it wouldn't have matched anyway. Should they fill it with plaster and paint it to preserve the historical integrity of the mosaic, or should they insert new tesserae which would destroy the historical integrity of the mosaic, but create a uniform surface that catches the light in the same way? The decision was, since it is not just a museum piece, but it is a focal point for prayer, new mosaic tesserae could be introduced as long as they were documented so that we knew where each one was, and a person would have the option to remove them in the future. They were afraid that this would be condemned by their fellow conservators, but when they have explained it to them, it has been met with universal approval. And it is splendid now. We look forward to the revelation of this mosaic. We want to take the opportunity to have scholars speaking about the art history of the mosaic, the theological significance of the mosaic, the construction of the basilica, and many related themes, and then these essays could be published and distributed widely. So it is yet another example of a treasure that has been preserved through the centuries in the remote monastery, but that has significance for the whole world, and our efforts to preserve that and share that with the whole world. So that is our goal and our task, to preserve not only the architecture, the mosaic, the icons, the manuscripts, but to share these treasures with the world and to preserve as a living entity this remarkable spiritual heritage, the spiritual goals that have been in place since the 4th century, so that we remain a living institution and a living continuity of this great heritage. I think that having made these brief remarks as an introduction, I would like to continue the conversation with questions that people would like to raise. Yes? Greek iconostasia tend to be very low. You have the principal icons below, you have one row showing the feast day icons, and that is it. And in the 18th century, it was a style to have everything bright and white and polished, and so they plastered over the original granite. They painted the capitals green to make them look more like marble, and then they built this extraordinarily high iconostasion for a Greek iconostasion. It was made in Crete, and then it was brought to the monastery. It must have been a gigantic task to take such a large icons, a large iconostasion, and install it there. It's surmounted by a cross that's larger than life size. It does go all the way to the ceiling. And Kurt Weissman put a lot of pressure on the monastery. If you don't take down the iconostasion, at least remove the cross so that from the back of the church people have a clear view of the mosaic. But the iconostasion has been there from the 18th century. It is a splendid work in its own right. And since the structure exists from the 6th century, you would think it would be possible to take down the iconostasion, remove the plaster, take out this ornate inlaid floor, return the church to what it looked like in the 6th century. But every century has made its contribution, and I think it would be a mistake to try to do that. But we have been told that we could scan the church with modern scanning cameras and then make a video computer visualization so that we could say, this is what the church looked like in the 6th century. So without violating the church, we could restore representation of what it looked like originally. It was written in Latin, and it first came to the attention of scholars in the 19th century. It's thought that she came from Spain around the year 383. Her name is given in various forms. Usually it's Egeria, but sometimes it's called Etheria, and it does exist in English in several translations. She wrote it for the benefit of her fellow nuns in Spain, and it is just common remarks. But any common remark from the 4th century becomes critical to understand what the Holy Land was like in the 4th century, what Sinai was like in the 4th century. And the beginning of it is missing. When she leaves Sinai, she goes through Faran, and she says, but I described this at the beginning of my text. But it is thought that another author who wrote a pilgrim account relied on her account, so from his account we can restore the missing sections from her account. A number of pilgrims visited, and all of their works are essential. And what we find is that the monks don't write about themselves. It is usually the pilgrims, the visitors, who write and describe the monastery. And sometimes their information is accurate, sometimes it's not, but it's the information that we have. And there are whole centuries when we know very little about the monastery, and it is from the library that we can understand the monks who came there, the pilgrims who came there, bringing manuscripts with them as gifts, and the study of the library allows us to reconstruct the history of the monastery from the time we know so little about it. There are many Bedouin tribes in the Sinai, and the Bedouin who live across from Gaza had built many tunnels to smuggle things in, and there are hundreds of tunnels, and there were massive tunnels. They can drive whole cars through the tunnels. So it's not just a few small tunnels. It was a whole industry of taking things into Gaza. Gasoline in Egypt is subsidized by the government, so it's very inexpensive. And you can sell it for 10 times what it costs in Egypt if you take it into Gaza. So this became a whole industry. But also the Bedouin who lived there were polarized by the conflict, and so they have become some of the most polarized elements among the Bedouin population of the Sinai. The government has been trying to close these tunnels so that contact with Gaza is under government control. but that pits them against the Bedouin, and so you could say there's a war going on between the Bedouin who live on the border with Gaza and the government, police, and army. But what you see in the headlines, police killed in Sinai, and you think all of Sinai. It's important to realize that Gaza is 500 kilometers from the monastery, and the conflicts do not spill that far. So the monastery has remained peaceful and isolated throughout that time. The protests against Mubarak that started 2 years ago began as protests against the police. Every year they had Police Day when you were supposed to express your appreciation for the police, but the modern communications allowed people to come together and express their resistance to the police. So that is what it started the conflict against the government 2 years ago. And because of that, the police didn't know what their position was. And so all around the monastery, we have checkpoints where people are registered who are traveling to the monastery in order to protect the area, and the police failed to show up. It was at that time that the Bedouin made a special delegation. They came to the monastery. They said, "We have been with you all these centuries. We're not going to leave you now." So the Bedouin took up their positions at all the checkpoints, and they were making certain that the monastery was well protected. They also had sentinels around the monastery every night. They had their cell phones. They were determined that if anything happened, they would be the first to know and be able to defend the monastery. I wanted to photograph them, but I knew that this would not be possible because I thought it was so historic. These are the same people who were commissioned by the Emperor Justinian to build the monastery and to remain there and to protect the monastery. And 1400 years later, their descendants are still doing that. So it was a remarkable example of the solidarity that exists between the monastery and the local Bedouin. The Bedouin depend entirely on visitors to the area for their economy. So they're the first ones to condemn any act of violence anywhere in Egypt and fully support peaceful and protected travel to the Sinai. Under President al-Sisi, things have become more stable and visitors are coming now in numbers. The Russians were the first ones to have direct flights from Moscow and from St. Petersburg to Sharm el-Sheikh, even from Ekaterinburg, remote areas of Russia. They have direct flights to Sharm el-Sheikh on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. They come there for a week's vacation, but included in their vacation package is a trip to St. Catherine's Monastery. And so this is a new development. We would not have thought 10 years ago that Russians would become the predominant ethnic group visiting Sinai. And increasingly, Russians live and work in the area to cater to the Russian visitors to the area, and then they come to the monastery because it's a local church. And so on the Feast of Pascha, on the first of Easter, we had about half of the people there were Russians, and we had many blonde-headed children running around. So this is quite a new development for Sinai. And the Bedouin are learning Russian to be able to sell their books and wares to the visiting Russians. I think that I've read that 1/3 of the visitors to Egypt today are Russians, so it is a sizable number of visitors. And also they leave us names for commemoration in the liturgy, and the monks have had to become experts in reading Russian handwriting to be able to commemorate these names in the services. The monastic community in earlier centuries was drawn from the whole of Christendom. We know that one of the monks in the 4th century was from Rome, and we know that throughout the history of the monastery it has remained predominantly Greek, but it has also been the goal of pilgrims and monastics from the whole of Christendom, and that is reflected in the Sinai library. We have the predominant number of manuscripts in Greek, but altogether we have 11 different languages. The most sizable number are Arabic, Syriac, Georgian, and Slavonic after the Greek. And this wide range of languages is because of the wide range of nationalities, both of pilgrims and of monks who lived there in previous centuries. There's mention about one abbot who lived there in the 10th century who was fluent both as a speaker and as a scribe in Greek, Arabic, and Syriac. In later times, the community became exclusively Greek, and there is a rule today that a person must be Greek to join the community. But one monk mentioned, we have our rules and we have the exceptions to the rules. And so it is by exception to the rule that I've been allowed to join the community, and there is one monk from England. But the other monks are from Greece and very proud of the continuous Greek heritage that has been there from the 4th century. Sinai has always been a part of the Holy Land. Pilgrims who came to Jerusalem, if they had the time and the stamina and the means, they would continue on their way to Sinai. So as a part, within the orbit of Jerusalem, it was part of the Greek-speaking world from the 4th century, and it has remained so to this day. So we can't talk about 17 centuries of Greek continuity there in the context of modern Greece, but we can in the context of the Greek-speaking world that was followed the conquest of Alexander the Great. It was because of him that Greek became the language that everyone spoke in common, and because of this that the New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament was translated into Greek in what is known as the Septuagint, and it is that Greek heritage that has remained at Sinai to this day. The monastery has many properties in Crete, and I think throughout the history of the monastery, the predominant number of monks from Greece has been from Crete, and that is true even today. So we have monks from Crete, and each part of Greece has its own heritage, and all of that is reflected in the community as well. I think individually none of us amount to much, but collectively we are the tradition and the inheritors of this great spiritual heritage, and the ones who try to carry that through and preserve it as a living heritage. The heritage of the monastery is that the monks met with Muhammad, and he dictated a letter of protection for the monks and for the Christians in the area. The letter is a series of conditions. The first relate to the monastery. An example is, if the monastery has a church, the church is not to be confiscated and used for another purpose. But it was also for the Christians in the area. And one of the conditions is, if a Christian woman marries a Muslim husband, she is free to attend her Christian services. So it was rules that were put into effect to ensure harmony between the local Christians and the monks who were living in Sinai and the new Muslim rulers. And we know that by the end of the 7th century, the local Bedouin had become Muslim. So rules for Christians living in the area would not have applied after the end of the 7th century. And this is one of the evidences for the authenticity of this document. We also know that it was not unique. There were a number of documents for the protection of Jews and Christians living in what is today the peninsula of Saudi Arabia. This precedent was continued by later rulers. The monastery has 1,000 Arabic scrolls and 800 scrolls in Turkish, and many of these are decrees from the ruler guaranteeing the rights and the inviolability of the monastery. We have some of these from Ottoman times are splendid works of art. They're written in alternating letters of gold leaf, black and red ink, and with very beautiful decorations. At the death of each sultan, the decrees issued by that sultan became void, and then you had to have a decree from the new sultan. So we have many of these decrees, and they are also such an important example of the esteem in which the monastery was held throughout the centuries of Islamic rule, and with modern cameras, you can photograph a landscape and then stitch all the photographs together. And I'm eager to use that same technology to take close-ups of these scrolls in sequence and then stitch the images together so that you end up with one photograph for each scroll, no matter how long it is, but it is of such high resolution that you can zero in and see seals and scribal signatures in every detail of these documents. These also would be a very, very important witness to peaceful relations between Muslim governments and the monastery, and deserve to be photographed and known by scholars today. I think 50 years ago, you could, certainly here in the United States and in Europe as well, you could take it very much for granted that a person had some exposure to the scriptures, some exposure to the church, some understanding of the church and the scriptures. And that is no longer the case. I've known professors who say that when they refer to something in the Bible in a class, they have to almost act as if a person has no understanding, because people grow up today without any exposure to the church or to the scriptures. So it is important to remind people about the heritage that we have, and even so, even more so to expose them to these. I think today that there's a greater appreciation for spirituality and for spiritual values, but we have to convey these to people without any background. One of the most important manuscripts that we had and still have is the Codex Sinaiticus. This has been called the world's oldest Bible because the original manuscript contained the whole of the Christian scriptures from Genesis to the book of Revelation. It also included the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas as part of the manuscript. We know that the early Christians wrote copies of the scriptures mostly on papyrus because this was the common writing material of the classical world. And they were copying out scriptures in hiding because there were times when a person could be put to death for having a copy of the scriptures. So it was a very heroic thing to be copying the scriptures and to be making copies and distributing copies. With the end of the persecution of the Christians in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine, it then became possible to have professional scribes writing copies of the scriptures on the finest materials. And when you look at the Codex Sinaiticus, it's astonishing how fine the parchment is. When you measure it, it's between 1/4 of a millimeter and 1/10 of a millimeter. And we don't know how they got animal skins so fine. In later centuries, they would stretch the skin on a frame and shave it with a blade, but you cannot get a skin that thin and that even with that method. So they must have had some way of putting it on a flat surface and abrading the surface to achieve such extraordinary parchment. And then it's written in very, very beautiful capital letters. When people would write scrolls, they would write many, many multiple columns on a scroll that might be 30 feet long. And the Codex Sinaiticus is written in that same style. It's many, many narrow columns, but it is written 4 columns to the page. It marks the transition from earlier texts written on scrolls to the newer text written in the codex form bound in the book. When Constantine, scholars had come to Sinai and they had seen and studied the Codex Sinaiticus, but they did not have the background to understand the antiquity of the text or the significance of the text. When Constantine Tischendorf came to the Sinai in 1844, looking for the earliest copies of the scriptures, he was beside himself because he realized at a glance how old this was and how important it was. He managed to take 44 leaves with him, and they are at the University of Leipzig. It was on a subsequent visit that he saw the rest of the manuscript. He asked if it could be sent to Cairo so that he could make a copy of it, and from that copy they could publish the text. This was done in the monastery's eagerness to share its heritage, but then he realized how complicated it is. There are multiple levels of correction in the text where people would take later manuscripts and alter the text to reflect these later readings, and it becomes quite complicated to know what was the original reading, what was added by a later corrector, and there were 3 or 4 correctors working over the text. And all of this makes for very great complications when you're trying to make a copy. So that is when he asked, could the monastery send the original manuscript to Russia? And the monastery agreed on the condition that upon its publication it would be returned to the monastery. It was taken to Russia in 1859. It was published in 4 magnificent volumes in 1862. It was the oldest copy of the scriptures known, so it became famous throughout the world. And one of the leading government officials said, all right, we have fulfilled our obligation to publish the text, now we have our obligation to return the text. But other Russians said, hold on, maybe this is not necessary, let's find a way to keep the text. And it became a very, very complicated communication between the monastery and the Russian Empire. The result was, in 1869, the Russians kept the text in return for payments and grants to the monastery. It was still in Russia in 1933, at the time of the revolution, when Stalin was desperate for funds. He offered it to England if they could raise 200,000 pounds. Well, this is during the Great Depression, when people were watching pennies. 200,000 English pounds was out of the question. So they started negotiations, and they finally settled on 100,000 pounds if half of it would come through popular subscription. And people were so enthused to rescue this manuscript and to have it as a treasure of England that they gave over half of the amount that was needed, and they have it today as one of the great treasures of the British Library. Well, we've always resented the loss of the manuscript. We do have a number of pages and fragments that survive at Sinai, and when the Russians sold it to England, they kept certain fragments at St. Petersburg. So it is today at 4 different places: in London, St. Petersburg, Leipzig, and Sinai. And in 2002, the Archbishop received a letter from the British Library. Would the monastery participate in a collaboration to conserve all of the existing leaves and fragments, to photograph them, to have experts make a completely new transcription of this text, and then to make a website where it would all be accessible, but also to make a facsimile? Because in their experience, even if things are available free on the internet, people still want a quality facsimile to be able to approach it as they approach the original manuscript. At first, the bishop would not agree to this because of the resentment over the history of this manuscript. But friends who knew the monastery and knew the head of the British Library convinced the Archbishop that we're not going to resolve these historical questions, but can we consider setting them aside to accomplish something that's so important, to make this manuscript accessible and to remind people about the importance of the early Christian documents. And so then the bishop was prepared to consider the matter. And then he went to the British Library and he said it was a mistake to have a junior member of staff write the Archbishop of Sinai. We needed a letter from the director of the British Library. So that we received in due course, and she signed herself, "I remain your eminence's most obedient servant." So with this preparation, then 2 curators came from the British Library. They met with the Archbishop and scholars and representatives of the monastery in Athens, and they began a collaboration. I represented the monastery in all these discussions, and it was necessary to go to London once or twice a year to carry on these discussions. By 2005, we had an agreement that we could subscribe to, and then by 2009 we had finished the website and the transcription, the conservation and the photography, and all of this was made public, and a facsimile was published in the following year. So it has been a very, very important way for students, for schools, and for the general public to see an important 4th century copy of the scriptures and to be able to study this. This has always been a manuscript that anyone interested in the history of the New Testament, anyone interested in the history of the Septuagint will have to study in detail because it is an extremely important manuscript. But even if you have only started the study of Greek, you can find a familiar passage in the Gospels and have the thrill of reading a 4th century manuscript in its original photography without having to rely on this transcription of other scholars. So it is done a lot to encourage people to appreciate the early manuscripts, to see them as something that is approachable, something they can read for themselves, where they do not have to depend solely on the transcriptions of other scholars to study such texts. And it is also an example of institutions setting aside differences in order to accomplish something so important. When I was in 9th grade in high school, I had an amazing history teacher, and I think from that point I became very interested in history. And it's usual to study Pharaonic Egypt, classical Greece, imperial Rome. You touch on the Dark Ages, you have the glories of the medieval cathedrals, and then you come into the modern world. And I always wondered, well, what happened in between? How do you get from classical Greece to imperial Rome? How do you get from Pharaonic Egypt to the later Greek Egypt? What happened in between? And having grown up a Protestant, I knew a lot about the New Testament and a lot about the Reformation, but not about what happened in between. So it was at the university that I began to pursue this. And I think increasingly universities and schools have classes in Byzantine studies, medieval studies. I couldn't find anything very much along those lines where I was going to school. So it was mostly in readings on my own, speaking to professors and colleagues, and meeting friends who had experiences and could help me in this quest. And so I began reading the significance, the symbolism of the great medieval cathedrals, but then eventually, looking for continuity, I began to read Byzantine history. And I had read many books on Byzantine history before I began to concentrate on the historical church. And it was only after I'd read many books in these areas that people said, you know, the Orthodox Church is still around, and I began to attend Orthodox services. And I found the services quite bewildering because I had no idea of the structure of the services, but I was determined to link what I had read with what I was witnessing. And the more I understood, the more I felt I'd found a great treasure. So I became Orthodox during the years I was at the university, and then it was 3 years after graduation that I decided to enter a monastery. I was at another monastery for 22 years, and then in 1996 I moved to Sinai and was accepted as a member of the community and have been there ever since. When I had thought about going to Sinai, people had told me, you can't go to Sinai, you're not Greek. But I visited there as a pilgrim in 1995 and met the monk from England. And so I thought, if there's a way for a monk from England to be there, perhaps there's room for me. But I knew that they wouldn't know me, and if I wrote them and said, can I come, they wouldn't know me at all. So I just bought a one-way ticket to Egypt and showed up and said, can I stay? and they accepted me beyond expectation, and I have been a member of the community. And then from my background with computers and scanners, they assigned me the task of photographing the manuscripts. And then it was about 10 years ago that the former librarian of the monastery resigned because he was spending more and more of his time in Greece with obligations there. And whenever there are 5 offices in the monastery that are called the Holy Council, that governs the monastery in conjunction with the archbishop or in the absence of the archbishop. And the archbishop names several candidates for each of these positions, and then the entire community votes among those candidates as to who they want to have these positions. So it's a balance between, it's a voice of the whole community and a balance between the archbishop and the community. And so I was beyond expectation, I was elected librarian with responsibility for these texts. Whenever I was photographing them, I had an eagerness to see the manuscripts, and that can only be done by the librarian. And by having only one person responsible, if anything goes missing, it is that one person's responsibility. And then when I was elected librarian, we made an account of everything. I was finally given the keys. I could finally look at anything I wanted. And it wasn't so exciting as I thought, because you see the dilapidated state of many of the manuscripts, you understand the need for conservation that many of them present. And so it was feeling that responsibility that made it less of an excitement than what I had first expected. But we are in the process of renovating the library building, which is scheduled for completion at the end of this coming year. And then I will take everything out of storage and put it into the new quarters, and everything will be more accessible. It'll be easier for scholars to visit. And also we have a new digitizing room for the photography of the manuscript, so that also will become easier with the renovation of the building. So important things are happening to preserve things better and to make them more accessible. When we had a pilot project for the photography of the manuscripts with high-resolution digital cameras, it was recommended from the very beginning that we have an internet site, that we have internet accessibility, that we have distribution from Greece, which would be more accessible than Sinai, and that we have the storage of these manuscripts at remote locations, the photographs of the manuscripts at remote locations, so that all of these things would be for the security of the photographs and for their accessibility. But many of the monks do not understand the internet, do not trust the internet. They feel that anything that's posted online can be taken and used in any way you want, and where that might not be a problem for a national library, it does become a concern for the monastery. We discussed this with the British Library. They have taken all of their most precious manuscripts, even illuminated manuscripts, and put them online, making them freely available. They think that if a high school student can use one of these in a paper that he's writing, it far outweighs the chance of someone taking the illuminations, putting them on coffee cups and selling them for his own profit. But the monastery feels a responsibility for these texts, and they want to make certain that they are used in a responsible way. So having internet access is something that we are still discussing and considering. But the current project that we have for the photography of the palimpsest has an agreement where we will make everything accessible as part of the funding of this project. It is a 5-year project, and we are at about the midpoint. When you have a palimpsest and the faint underwriting cannot be read under the overlying text, it is photographed in what is called multispectral imaging. You photograph it with narrow bandwidths of light. You photograph it with ultraviolet light, blue light, purple light, green light, yellow light, all the way up to infrared. You photograph it with light coming from above. Many times the original text is visible if you photograph it with raking light coming from the side. And there are manuscripts where there is no ink left from the original text, but where the ink used to be has etched into the parchment. So if you shine a light through the parchment, you can make out where the original text was, and you can read that. So we photograph it with overhead light, with raking light, with transmissive light. You end up with 31 photographs for each leaf. And then imaging specialists have developed algorithms for the processing of these, and you don't know exactly what algorithms are going to clarify the underlying image. So there's a certain amount of experimentation that relies on the experience of an imaging specialist, and you process these. But it's best if the two inks are different, because if the underlying text was iron gall ink and the overlying text was carbon ink, they are very different. They will fluoresce differently, and you can find a light that will react to the lower ink and make it very clear. If the two inks are very similar, then it becomes much more difficult to distinguish the two. So it requires not just science, but a certain amount of art in knowing which algorithms to bear, and it requires experimentation to know which ones work. But we feel confident that by the end of the project, we will know which algorithms are the most common in yielding visible images. We can have a software program so that someone who's not a trained imaging specialist can do the processing and then only take the most difficult cases to the specialist. So it's very exciting to see these underlying texts that people have been so eager to read from having seen the texts that are visible in the margins, and then suddenly see them visible and legible. We have over 20 specialists who are involved in the project. We will take the photographs, process the image, and then give them out to people who are already familiar with the different Sinai manuscripts in each of the different languages involved. And then their task is to tell us the subject of the text and to assign a date based on paleography, but not to make formal editions of the text. We only want them to make this preliminary identification, and then we want to make the images accessible to anyone so that texts do not become the preserve of one scholar and everyone is waiting for that one scholar to finish his work. We want them to become widely accessible, and then they can benefit the entire scholarly world. And when these have been made generally available, we'll have a precedent for making the rest generally available. At present, a person will write me and they will say, have you photographed this text? If I have, I send him the images. If I haven't, then I put it on the list of things that need imaging. And it is such requests that are guiding the project. I had thought that we'd start out trying to identify the more significant texts within each language category. And in reality, we are not quite keeping up with the requests of scholars. And it is those requests that are guiding which manuscripts we photograph. But we also want to have funding to have more cameras, more staff, and do things in a more robust way. And we plan to do that with the installation of the new digitizing rooms in the renovation of the building. I think Sinai is unique in having a mosque within the monastery. This dates from the 10th century. It was a pre-existing structure that was converted into a mosque. A ruler of Egypt at the time was Al-Hakim, and he was the one who pulled down the 4th century church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem that was built by the Emperor Justinian. By the time the Crusaders took the area, that was one of the things that sparked the Crusades, rebuild the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. By the time the Crusaders took the area, the stones of the narthex had been used elsewhere. The Byzantine emperor had been given permission to rebuild the rotunda over the tomb itself, and then when it was part of the Latin kingdom, it was rebuilt by the Crusaders. The original church faced west, facing the tomb, but the Crusader church was reoriented facing east, and the existing structure is sort of late Romanesque, early Gothic, built at the time of the Latin kingdom. There are elements that survive from earlier centuries. When you first walk in, it's quite a bewildering structure because it dates from so many different periods, it contains so many different elements, and it's only on experience that you learn how to distinguish the different areas of the church, the different epochs of the church, and then it becomes very, very profound. The same ruler threatened to pull down the church at the monastery. And the story is that the monks were tipped off. Within 3 days, they converted one of the existing structures that is thought to have been a hospice for pilgrims, and they made it a mosque. And then when he came, he was appeased, and he spared the church. But ever since the 10th century, you've had the church and the mosque next to each other as symbols of collaboration. It's never been used as a place for Muslim worship, but it is a mosque, and it is an emblem of peaceful coexistence. We have Bedouin who work for the monastery, and the Muslims have a custom of saying prayers 5 times a day. You don't not need a mosque for this. People put down a carpet wherever they are, they face towards Mecca, and they say the prescribed prayers. Sometimes monks come from Athos, and they're shocked that Muslims are saying prayers inside the monastery, and they tell us, this is not right, you should tell them to leave. But we let them know that we have had peaceful relations with the Muslims all these centuries, and this is an example of the peace and harmony. We've never had religious services with them. Fervent Muslims would not want that with Christians. Fervent Christians would not want that with Muslims. So we have a way of keeping the fervor of the faith and at the same time maintaining this mutual respect. I think after Chalcedon, most of the Christians in Egypt rejected Chalcedon and became what is known today as the Coptic Church. They do not call themselves Copts. They call themselves Egyptian Orthodox. So if you say, are you Orthodox? They will say yes. You have to specify, are you Egyptian Orthodox? They call us Roman Orthodox, going back to the Roman Empire. The Byzantines called themselves Rome, and the language that they spoke, Romaic, all the way up to 1453. So they still call us Roman Orthodox, and they call themselves Egyptian Orthodox. St. Catherine's Monastery was in the orbit of Jerusalem. So we accepted Chalcedon. We have remained in the orbit of Jerusalem even to this day. We are not under the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, but we confer with them if we need a synod of bishops, and the Archbishop of Sinai is always consecrated by the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem. St. Anthony's Monastery is due west of Sinai, but in between you have the Gulf of Suez, the Red Sea. So to reach St. Anthony's Monastery from St. Catherine's Monastery, you have to drive west to the coast, north all the way up to Suez, and then south and a little west again to reach the monastery. I've only been there once, and I went with some Greeks who were interested in seeing the cleaning of the frescoes. They have amazing frescoes that date from the 12th and 13th centuries. These have turned black with age, and they had funding to bring experienced conservators from Italy who very, very slowly and patiently clean the frescoes, and now they're visible. This was done under the direction of Elizabeth Bowman, who teaches at Temple University, and some of you may know her. So it was a remarkable achievement, and she has since done comparable work at the Red Monastery in Upper Egypt. We have cordial relations with the Coptic Church. The Archbishop has a personal friendship with the Patriarch of the Copts, and so we have very good cordial relationships. Many Copts come to Sinai as pilgrims. Many Copts work for the monastery, keeping the monastery church and working in other capacities. But when they come, they always understand that we are separate churches, so we don't have services together. But there are no Coptic churches in the area of the Sinai Monastery, and the Copts attend our own services. There are Coptic churches at Sharm el-Sheikh, at El Tor, and other cities in the Sinai Peninsula. Surprises. It's a little frustrating to always be making manuscripts accessible to visiting scholars and not to have time to study them myself. But I have been able to study a few of them, and then with the help of other scholars, I've tried to write essays on them, and a few of them have been published. And it's been the benefit of trying to write something is what you learn in the process of writing the essay. And one example, one of the palimpsests fascinated me. It is a copy of the Epistles of St. Paul. It dates from about the 9th or perhaps the early 10th century. It is written in parallel Greek and Arabic. And underneath you can see 3 different texts. Many people are saying, you have the Palimpsest Project, what have you found? But you know, at the time, 2 years ago, we were just beginning to give these texts to scholars. We didn't have results yet. But I thought, why don't I study this? I'm not going to come to conclusions, but perhaps I could see the outlines of what the manuscript represents. So people, when they ask us, what have you found? I could share this with other scholars as a way of informing them about the Palimpsest Project and as a way of inviting their participation. So I began to study this. I did a textual study on the manuscript. I found a number of readings that seem early and important. And we know that the area came under Arab rule in the 7th century. It was by the end of the 8th century that Christians began to adopt Arabic as their language. And it was at the end of the 8th and 9th century that many, many texts were translated into Arabic. The Archbishop has been there since 1961. He became the Archbishop in 1973. In 1961, the monastery was not very well known. So he has living memories of when Weizmann came there, and made such an important study of the architecture and the manuscripts and the icons that are at Sinai. So it is after that time that Sinai has become so well known, and the roads that are there today were built in the 1970s, and from that time it became accessible in a way that had not been there before. They have documents at Dumbarton Oaks that show the packing list for the expeditions of Weitzman. He had to be there sometimes with a team of 8 people for 3 months. And it's so many cases of Jell-O and so many cases of cake mix. And it's amazing the preparation that they had to go through to bring so many supplies to sustain them all the time that they were there, because they could not expect so many people to be there at the expense of the limited supplies available to the monks and the community there. That all changed, and there have been times when we have over 1,000 people a day coming to the monastery. So the question is, how do we survive as a monastery? At the great Meteoron, one of the great monasteries in central Greece, the monks are the guides, and pilgrims were there from morning till evening. And there was a community there that said, what are we doing? We've just become guides. And this is not what we became monks for. And so the whole community left, went back to Athos, and they had to form another community. So when you see instances like that, then you respect even more the careful balance that we have at Sinai. We have services beginning at 4 in the morning. They last until 7:30. The church is open to the public from 8:30 to 11:30. And when the visitors come in at 8:30 in the morning, they don't realize we've already had 3.5, 4-hour service that is concluded by that time. By the afternoon, the monastery is getting dark because it is in a narrow valley. So the monastery is only open to the general public from 8:30 to 11:30 in the morning. The monastery has many icons and many manuscripts and beautiful vestments, chalices, gospel covers, many, many treasures that we wanted to share with the general public, but could not do so in an individual manner. So in 2002, we established a museum that is next to the church to allow a visitor to come and see the church and then to go into the museum area and to see the icons and the manuscripts and the other treasures in the monastery. So all this has been a way to share the heritage and the treasures of the monastery with the general public. The general public used to enter through a door on the west wall of the monastery and come through the whole monastery going down to the church. But then in the 1980s, they cut a new door through the 6th century wall to allow visitors to come straight into the church area. And they can only come into that one area of the monastery. The result is that we can have over 1,000 people coming into the church and then seeing the museum next to the church, but they do not enter the rest of the monastery, and the rest of the monastery remains peaceful. In the church and in the museum, you have a few members of the community with their support staff that includes Bedouin and Copts, and with a relatively few number of members of the community, you can accommodate so many visitors. So we have this special balance. It is when Orthodox groups come who want to join us in the services that they join us for Vespers and join us for the liturgy in the morning. And then we have been trying to encourage the Russians who have religious freedom now to remember their amazing spiritual heritage and to try to recover and rekindle that heritage. And so we used to bring out the relics of St. Catherine quite rarely, mostly on the feast of St. Catherine and a few other special occasions. But now, every day, when the visitors leave at 11:30, the Russians and other Orthodox remain behind, and we bring out the relics of St. Catherine, and everyone venerates the relics. In the life of St. Catherine, she had a dream in which Christ gave her a ring, and he said, "Be faithful to me." And when she woke up, she was wearing this ring. And because of this significant episode in her life, we give a ring to the pilgrims who venerate the relics that has the seal of the monastery, and it is a blessing from the monastery and from the saint. The priest standing there may be there for half an hour or even more, as hundreds and hundreds of Russians come to venerate the relics, but we feel that this is very, very important. But even that does not include members of the whole community. And it is during the services that we see the Orthodox pilgrims who come to the monastery, but then when you're all praying together, you feel a concord, and there are many side chapels. The reality is that the visitors all stand in the middle of the church, the monks go to the side chapels, and they get used to the side chapels. They remain there during the services, even if there are no visitors. And sometimes you're celebrating the liturgy, and it looks like there are only about 5 people in this vast church. And it is at the end of the service that everyone comes out of the side chapels to receive the blessed bread at the end of the service, and then you realize how many people were actually there. So there are many ways to survive and keep a concentration and a spirit of prayer with so many visitors coming to the monastery, even joining us in the services.